Boulevard Haussmann, between Rue de Royle and Rue de Courcelles. Despite the lamentable reluctance on the part of the police to pass on any information, we have been able, through our own investigations, to establish the following facts. The third floor of 137 Boulevard Haussmann has been occupied for the last 5 years by Dr. Philip Shave, 44, along with his wife and 3-year-old daughter. The Javes occupy both apartments on this floor, one of them serving as a waiting room and luxurious consultation rooms. For the doctor's patients are drawn from the most elegant strata of society, and many figure in Who's Who. On 1st July, the Zhao family, accompanied by their child's nurse, left Paris for a 6-week holiday in Cannes, where they had rented the Villa Maritz. On the same day, a young doctor, Dr. Negral, took his colleague's place during consulting hours. Normally, apart from the nurse, the Javes have 2 maids. One of them, who has family in Normandy, took her holiday at the same time as her employers, and only Joseph Chauvet, 51, stayed on in Paris. As the residential apartment was empty, she only had to take care of the surgery. Dr. Negral, a bachelor living in furnished rooms in Rue Saint-Pierre, came every morning at 9 o'clock, took note of any phone calls, went on his rounds, had his lunch in a restaurant, and at 2 o'clock returned to Boulevard Haussmann for afternoon surgery. Around 6 o'clock he was free from his duties, and Joseph Chauvet took the opportunity to go to her daughter's, where she usually spent the night. She lives in the neighborhood, Rue Washington. So, what happened? Because the police are being so tight-lipped, it is difficult to reconstitute the chain of events. But a certain number of facts can be established. Last Saturday, Dr. Negral left the surgery at Boulevard Haussmann at 5:30. Josepha was still there. During the course of that afternoon, he had seen half a dozen patients, but no one in the building had spotted any unusual comings or goings. On Sunday, Dr. Negral visited friends in the country, while Josepha spent the day with her daughter in Rue Washington, only returning on Monday morning at 8 o'clock. She began, as usual, by vacuuming the waiting room. It was only when she reached the 3rd room that she was struck by an unusual smell, which she described as sickly and disgusting, though she wasn't unduly concerned at first. Finally, a few minutes before 9, intrigued, she opened the door to a 4th, much smaller room, which had been converted into a laboratory. That was where the smell was coming from, or more precisely, it was coming from a cupboard. The cupboard was locked. The key. Turning round, she saw Dr. Negral arriving. Did she give a start? Did she turn pale? The indirect witness accounts that we have gathered are contradictory on this point. He allegedly said to her, "What are you doing here?" She reportedly replied, "Can't you smell it?" Apparently, she thought it was a dead rat. Did Dr. Jave leave you any keys? Of course, we are simply piecing together the facts as best we can. A few minutes later, Joseph left the building to go to fetch a locksmith on Rue de Roman, and she returned with him. As he read this, Maigret wondered where Lassin could have dug up all these details. It wouldn't have been Joseph who talked to him. He would swear to that. Still less Dr. Negral, the concierge. It was possible. Maybe later the locksmith. He read on. When they finally got the door to the cupboard open, the sight that met them was that of a completely naked woman who had been bent double to squeeze her into the narrow space. In the absence of Detective Chief Inspector Maigret, it was Inspector Janvier who arrived on the scene, followed by the pathologist from the prosecutor's office, while the press, for reasons we have so far been unable to ascertain, were kept at a distance. There was no difficulty in identifying the body, as it was that of Madame Jave herself, whom everyone believed to be in Caen. Apart from a bruise on the right temple which could have been caused by a fall, the body displayed no signs of violence. Dr. Negril claims not to have seen Madame Jave either on Saturday or on any other day since 1st July, when Dr. Jave and his wife set off for Caen. Joseph has apparently made the same statement. So how was the young woman killed, and when? We believe that the pathologist places the time of death on Saturday. At midday on Monday, Dr. Jave was informed by telephone and caught a plane to Paris from Nice. He spent the night along with Dr. Negril at the police judiciaire. We have no details of their statements. Even this morning, the police refused to confirm whether either of the two men has been arrested. Examining Magistrate Caleo is in charge of the case, but he has been even less forthcoming than Inspector Janvier. Our correspondent in Caen has tried to make contact with the nurse, Mademoiselle Juseron, who stayed down there with the child, but he was unable to gain access to the villa, which has already been visited twice by the flying squad. Clearly, this is one of the most mysterious cases of recent years, and there will no doubt be further dramatic developments. Who killed Madame Jave, and why? Why was her completely naked body stashed in a cupboard behind her husband's consultation room? While we await the repercussions that will inevitably follow, we are able to provide some information about the characters involved in this drama. Dr. Philippe Jave, 44, was born in Poix. After successful studies at the Elder Médecine in Paris, he became a hospital trainee. Prior to his marriage, he practiced in Il Mulino. His surgery was a modest one, and his patients were mainly workers from the nearby factory. 5 years ago, he married Evelyn Legarec, 16 years his junior, who was therefore 28 at the time of her death. The Legar family owned a canning plant in Concano. Housewives will be very familiar with the Logar Aurore brand of sardines. Soon after the marriage, the newlyweds moved to a luxury apartment on Boulevard Haussmann, and Dr. Jave quickly established himself as one of the most sought-after doctors in the capital. 2 years later, Mr. Legarec Senior died, leaving the family business to his son Yves and his daughter. The Jave have a 3-year-old daughter, Michelle. As for Dr. Negrel, he too is a talented doctor. Aged 30, he is a bachelor and still occupies his student rooms on Rue Serre, where he leads a modest life. He is not set up in practice, but works with Professor Leb. This is the first time he has agreed to stand in as a locum for one of his colleagues. We have tried to establish whether the Javes and Dr. Negrel were on friendly terms prior to this arrangement, but we have received no reply to our inquiries. At every turn, be it Quides or Fives Olivard Haussmann, or within the medical profession, we come up against a strange wall of silence. Even the concierge has been unforthcoming and is merely willing to affirm that she was unaware that Madame Jave was in the building. However, our correspondent on the Côte d'Azur has uncovered some information, albeit slim pickings. On Saturday morning at Nice Airport, a passenger corresponding to the description of Madame Jave was reportedly seen boarding the 915 plane, due to arrive at Paris or Orly at 11:15. The airline refuses to confirm whether or not her name appears on the passenger list. At the time of going to press, Dr. Paul is conducting a post-mortem. When Maigret got back home, he carefully cut out the article and slipped it inside a manila folder, as he did when he was opening a file at KD or FEV, except that in the office his files would contain original, authentic documents, whereas here he had to be content with more or less fictionalized cuttings from newspapers. "Are you ready, Madame Maigret?" She emerged from the bedroom dressed in a light cotton dress, a small white hat on her head, and white gloves on her hands. And as they walked along the street, arm in arm, they looked every inch like a couple on their holidays. "You seem to be starting to enjoy yourself," she remarked with a sidelong glance in his direction. He didn't reply, but merely smiled, not thinking about poor Madame Jacques, but imagining Janvier at the sharp end of this case, which he must be dead set on solving all on his own. Chapter 2. "Dinner at Pew. Calvados for everyone?" he asked as he drew his pipe out of his pocket, just as the waitress in the white apron was bringing the coffee. He understood the look his wife gave him, and the more furtive look she then gave Pardon. He wasn't drunk, not even slightly the worse for wear. He couldn't have drunk much more than the others, but he was nonetheless aware of a certain sparkle in his eyes and a relaxed manner of talking that wasn't usual to him. Twice during dinner, Madame Maigret had observed him tenderly, first when he had ordered fried white bait, then when he had asked for grilled smoked sausage with pomfret. She had recognized the restaurant in which they had not set foot for 20 years, and which they had visited on only 2 previous occasions. The sign still read Cher Palace. The wooden tables had been replaced with plastic versions in garish colors, and the bar inside had been modernized. The most extraordinary thing was that PJ himself was still there and didn't seem to have aged at all, so much so that with his mop of white hair he looked like a film extra in a wig. Although they had come to Genveville in Pardon's car, it was Maigret who had chosen the restaurant opposite the L'Amour, around which boats and canoes glided. There was a dance taking place nearby, and its jaunty tunes were mingling with music from the restaurant's record player. There were not many customers, and most had slipped their jackets off. Quite a number were people from the neighborhood who had dropped in. Now, wasn't Maigret sticking to the program he had mapped out for his holiday? There are things that everyone talks about, even writes songs about, but never gets round to doing, he had declared at the start of the meal. One example is eating fried white bait in a bistro on the banks of the Marne. Tell me, Pardon, how often have you eaten white bait on the banks of the Marne? The doctor had searched in his memory. This had amused his wife, who had replied, "Once before my husband went into practice. You see, we've done it twice." By the same token, we talk about wandering the streets of Paris arm in arm. But we never have the time, alas. Pardon had sighed. "Well, this time I'm taking the opportunity. What do you think we did this afternoon?" "We took the bus to Plant Augustin, and wonders never cease. The bus was almost empty. We didn't encounter a single traffic jam. Then we walked back via Boulevard Haussmann without stopping." Without stopping. Maigret had looked at Dr. Jov's house. Of course, a group of curious onlookers had gathered outside the varnished carriage gate, and a uniformed police officer was watching them in a bored fashion. It was the first time in a case such as this that Maigret had found himself on the side of the Gorpers, and he found that amusing. The house stood between an oriental carpet shop and the shop front of a milliner's, which must have been very expensive as there was only one hat on display. It was just the sort of well-to-do, bourgeois, slightly old-fashioned building he had imagined. After that, they had continued on foot as far as Plast, where they had had a drink on a terrace before returning via Avenue d'Avagram and the Shell, just like provincial tourists visiting Paris. "Splendid," Maigret had said as he had put together his strange meal. His wife's first knowing look had been because this was exactly the same menu he had ordered the last time. Everything seemed to delight him: the music, the couples going into the dance, the canoeists on the Marne, the slowly descending dusk. You could sense that he would have liked to take his jacket off like the others, but didn't dare, perhaps because of Pardon. And the look she had given Pardon said, "You see how much better he is." It was true that he felt relaxed, as if rejuvenated. What the others were not aware of was that back in the spring he had got himself into a worse state than he would care to admit, even to himself. He would find himself worn out, exhausted by nothing at all, and was beginning to wonder whether he might end up like Baudard. Baudard was a colleague of his from Special Branch, a decent man, conscientious to a fault, who had found himself the victim of undeserved attacks. Maigret had stood up for him the best he could, but there were grubby political interests behind this whole affair, and certain people high up needed both. Baudard had fought back for 6 months, attempting to save not so much his job as his very honor. But one morning, while mounting the staircase at Quai, he had simply keeled over, dead. It was perhaps because of Baudard that Maigret had decided to take this holiday and to allow himself the little pleasures he normally didn't get to indulge in, such as this dinner by the man when he had gone to Rue Picpus to pick up Haron. The doctor had simply said, "Jave has returned home," and Négrel Maigret had asked, "I don't know." It was odd getting the information from a man like Pardon, who was not part of the force. They hadn't discussed it again during the meal, now that the men had been served with calvados and the women with allure. The latter did as they always did after dinner in Rue Picpus. They pulled their chairs together and started chatting in low voices. The air was mild, humid, and there was a fine mist lifting off the river. A couple in a canoe were drifting along on the current, playing tender love songs on a photograph. "I had Debelin on the phone earlier," Pardon was saying. "It turns out he knew Philippe Jave quite well. They did their training at the same time and socialized together until quite recently." What did he have to say? It seems that Jave comes from a fairly modest background in Poirier. His father was a bank clerk and his mother a teacher. His father died when he was young, and it was his mother who brought him up. It was only because of scholarships that he was able to complete his studies and student life. Can't have been that easy for him. According to Debelin, Jave is a plotter, bright, reserved, and strong-willed. Everyone expected him to specialize in cardiology, his passion, perhaps because he saw his father die of angina. Instead, he set himself up in a rather down-at-heel practice in Issy-Moulineaux and led the exhausting existence of most suburban doctors, working 14 or 15 hours a day. He was 38 or 39 when he went on holiday to Bouzec near Concarneau, where he met Evelyn, the Luger girl. Yes, they seemed to have fallen in love and he married her. Debelin often visited their home in Boulevard Haussmann, where they moved almost straight after the wedding. Debelin had the impression they were a close couple. Evelyn is pretty enough, but she doesn't exactly turn heads in the street. She had a rather joyless childhood, growing up in the house of her father, who was a widower. She was shy and self-effacing and had what Devlin calls a feeble smile. Devlin had the impression that she had health problems, but he didn't know the details as Jave was a discreet sort of fellow. That's more or less all I found out, except that the Jave seemed besotted with their little girl. They didn't go out much and received visitors about once a week. Debelin is just about the only one of on the 7 o'clock bulletin. They announced that the inquiry was taking its course and that Dr. Havey had returned to Boulevard Haussmann in a state of dejection. There they were, on the terrace of a suburban bistro, watching the lights reflecting off the man sipping a vintage Calvados. What was Janvier doing at that precise moment? Was he in his office at Kézerve gathering witness statements and waiting for news from his colleagues out and about in Paris or elsewhere? Not having time to have dinner, had he had some sandwiches and beers sent up from the Brasserie Dauphiné, as was their tradition? Pardon must have seen the nostalgic expression pass over his face, because he asked, tempted. Maigret looked him straight in the eye, thought for a moment, then said, number. It was true. The Boulevard Haussmann affair looked like it was turning into one of the trickiest and most demanding cases he had known. Firstly, because of the social milieu, it had to be handled with kid gloves. It is always difficult to take on people of higher social status because the slightest false move can lead to unfortunate consequences. Then this case was all about doctors. Certain professions tend to close ranks more than others, such as military officers, teachers, colonial officials, or however strange it may seem, post office employees. Janvier, who was pursuing an official inquiry, must be finding it harder to get information about Jave and Negrel than Maigret himself, who had his friend Pardon to turn to. As well as that, poor Janvier had been landed with Comio, the most disagreeable examining magistrate to deal with. Como was afraid of the press. Every article on a case he was involved in gave him the shakes, or else put him in a foul mood. Above all, not a word to the reporters, he would invariably insist. Conversely, to avoid being criticized by the more impatient members of the press, he had a tendency to treat the first available suspect as the guilty party and not release him from custody. As many as 50 or 100 times in his career, Maigret had stood up to him, sometimes at the risk of his own job. "What are you waiting for? Why don't you arrest him?" The little magistrate with a pointy mustache would bark, "I'm waiting for him to put the rope around his own neck. Or for him to escape over the border, maybe. Then the gutter press will have a field day." Janvier didn't have Marat's patience, his stubbornness, or his ability to let Comio's rages wash over him. Maigret was convinced that it was because of Como that Janvier had got on the wrong side of the papers from the start of the case by refusing to give them even the most basic snippets of information. Anything on Gilbert Negrel? Nothing more than I've already told you. He's a loner. Apart from his work for Professor Lebier, I haven't heard much about him, and I know nothing whatsoever about his personal life. He can't have any private wealth, as he hasn't thought of setting up a practice unless he is working on his diploma and is aiming to go into teaching. It would have been easy to ring Dr. Paul, the pathologist, who was a friend, to find out the results of the post-mortem. What did Evelyn Jav die of? There was no mention in the papers of a revolver, a knife, or strangulation. If she had had a fatal accident, there would have been no reason to literally fold her in half and push her into a cupboard. Tell me, pardon, how long after death is it possible to bend a body? That depends on the state of rigor mortis, and that in turn depends on a number of elements, including the ambient temperature. 1 hour in some cases, several hours in others. That didn't move him any further forward. On the other hand, he didn't want to get immersed in the case. He had decided that he would follow it in the way newspaper readers throughout France were following it at that moment, and nothing more. He was just a member of the public, not a policeman.